In a lot of cultures, copying older work was a traditional way of learning. And the end of the 19th century, the beginning of the 20th century, that tradition really died out. And we no longer have that tradition of the 10,000 hours, that idea of perfecting your craft. But recreative practice is slightly different because it's not an attempt to make an exact replica, but it's deconstructing historical objects and working out how they were made and attempting to make something contemporary but using very similar skills.
We are makers with our strengths and our minds and spirit. We start young, finding out early in life what it's like to feel something grow and take shape beneath our hands. Divide and specialize. One man to make one part, one to make another. Each to do what each can do best. The seed of mass production had been planted to multiply thousands of times the productive energy of every man. And then, the next great forward stride.
Part of my interest in recreative practice was going to museums. And there is one thread that goes through all of my work, and that's an understanding of ephemerality. So, for example, craft skills that had died out or experiences that have died out. When I saw Sedan Chair at the Museum of Leathercraft, I thought we no longer get carried around. We don't have that kind of experience. So I wanted to try and capture an experience of something that you don't really have anymore. The idea of the handmade, the relationship between the maker and the object, and then the object and the eventual user.
I see recreative practice as a means of accessing embodied knowledge, something you can't read a book about. It's only through that process of immersion, watching, observation, making lots of mistakes, learning through that process.
The term reconstructive practice is not something that I think most forensic scientists have ever come across. We do things in a particular way just because that's how they're done. We don't necessarily give it a specific name. I think broadly speaking, when it comes to crime scenes, for example, we might well typically recreate a real crime, or alternatively, we might produce something that's perhaps slightly contrived, but is designed to allow us to address particular learning points.
So there's lots of different ways that you can go about reconstruction in archaeology. Some of the more traditional techniques can tell you about production methods, it can tell you about materials. In this project, we're also trying to experiment with more novel techniques for reconstruction as well. This gives you a different set of possibilities. So one of the things that it allows you to do that more traditional methods of reconstruction doesn't is to get as close as possible to the exact shape of the original object. And this allows us to explore kind of wear traces that were on the original object in more detail.
So initially, the early stages of the project needed to have an artist involved from the archaeology team who would then reimagine the symbolic motives on the object. There were a number of illustrations that had been documented in the past, but they had found a number of cheek pieces. There was about 6 that were found, which were all slightly different. So we had to piece together the iconography, and then it was our job to place that in that metalwork context. And I think this was really important, how pronounced, maybe the iconography had to be.
I'm really interested in the ways in which we can pick up needles and thread and scissors to understand the changing sensory landscapes, the changing working conditions of women who were making fashion and dress items from the 18th and 19th century specifically, but I have gone all the way back to the 16th century and have gone all the way forward to the 20th century.
I accidentally discovered that the only surviving lace manufacturer in the UK is in Ilkeston. We went to visit the factory and it was an amazing experience. We walked through these enormous rooms full of machines that were now silent. And eventually just came upon one operating machine. I had this extraordinary sensation of a lost heritage, a lost skill. These were manufacturing skills that were passed from generation to generation. This sense of a final moment in a long heritage was really evident. It felt like the dying of a golden age of skills and an age where people identified with the work they produced and were proud of the work they produced.
My family have always worked in the ceramic industry. Going back to 1800, I trained within the ceramics industry when I left school at the age of 16. And I was immersed in a world of divided labour on the factory with explicit knowledge in abundance, but it was all geared towards specific processes.
I'm a third generation as a metal worker in my family. My ancestors early on were goldsmiths in India, and then the next generation came to England and started a jewellery business here. I trained under my grandfather and my father, and then I took it on into my career as an artist. So doing something quite different to what they did, but still using the same very old traditional hand-making skills.
And ReCreative practice allows you to do that reverse engineering, to think through the object not from the perspective of a viewer, but from the perspective of somebody who made it.
Our main technique that we use is microscopy. We're looking at the surface of objects, we're seeing how they were produced, but more importantly, how they were used, what they were actually used for. We're looking at the traces on the surface, and that allows you to really get a better understanding about how the object feels, how it was used, how effective it is at various different practices. So it's similar to a forensics in a way, where
the physical aspect is absolutely key in lots of ways. Clearly, the interplay between different pieces of evidence is often key, and in a number of cases, for example, blood patterns on a wall, you can't grab the wall, take it to a lab, and a photograph really doesn't necessarily provide the information that we might need ultimately.
3D printing opens up another range of possibilities. One of those is that we can scan an ancient object and print as many versions of it as we like. We can offer this to museums or other institutions to use for public outreach. You know, you can allow members of the public to kind of touch and explore and look at these objects really close up in a way that they wouldn't be able to necessarily with the original object.
That lovely dip in the elbow.
That looks like it's ceramic, that piece, doesn't it? Does it feel ceramic? It's not plaster.
It's colder. Oh, it's the sound. Well, not feel the sound, but that has a different sound.
It is plaster. That's plaster, yeah.
But
amazing.
It feels like a different kind.
It does, doesn't it? Amazing. Technology is a fantastic tool, but it cannot kind of have that material knowledge and haptic knowledge, can it? That understanding of materials with the tool, which makes the kind of human capacity so unique, really.
So the technology was a way to speed up a process, but the principle of how the construction has been built up is the same kind of approach that they would have used historically. So there was an iron internal core which was cast, and then on top of that there was a metal skin of silver which was embossed and decorated over the top. So my approach was to utilize the same principle methodology, but actually do it through a technological process.
One of the things that I always think is really fascinating when people question the historical accuracy of any kind of recreation is why they'd want to do that. Yes, it's impossible to get an 18th century textile fully reproduced, but in order to do that, you'd also need to be reproducing all of these sort of issues around the technical innovations that created those textiles. So historical accuracy as some kind of pinnacle is not only something we definitely do not want to achieve, but something that's impossible to achieve.
In this piece, I wanted to capture something of the manufacturing process. When I visited the factory, one of the things that really struck me was the way that the light hit the machines, the way that the threads would capture the light and almost looked like as if they were illuminated on these huge looms.
So you can have something that runs across in a narrow beam. I would suggest that if you're photographing that, you're going to backlight it pretty much, or at least run across the surface like you are doing there.
I wanted to make a piece of work that eventually, when the piece spins, it'll function almost like a beacon of light, and the light will travel around the exhibition space. And it was to hang on to that skill, that sense of objects that are labours of love, that are made for sharing with other people, and that are tokens of one's appreciation for other people.
I mean, what I know is that, and whoever has been in as part of that project has just been completely blown away. How have you managed to do that? How have you given this a completely new recreation? And I think that's the value for me, is that it's not a replica. They've agreed that actually this is a recreation.
This is something which we're currently actually trying to overcome, because a lot of the basis of the way in which dress historians have approached making and remaking in the past has been based in conservation or in experimental archaeology, where essentially you are trying to replicate an object. I have never taken a historical garment and gone, right, I'm going to make this stitch for stitch, because that is in no way going to come close to what the maker of that original garment's experience was. They weren't counting their stitches in order to make it exactly like the gown that they'd made beforehand. They were thinking creatively. They were thinking about, how do I make this garment and this vision that I have for this garment fit this particular body?
Is a way of understanding. It's a way of exploring the knowledge that objects embody, because they are more than just beautiful objects. They are the exemplar of a particular kind of knowledge. And that knowledge is fleeting or at risk of being lost.
You know, when you compare something what was made 100 years ago and you compare something which is made today, production has been streamlined to accommodate kind of, productivity. When you look at some of these objects and you handle them, and some of the tools what were involved in making them, they were very much a hand process. And you can feel the weight, and you can feel the finesse, and you can feel how that edge of the cup meets your lip. And it's a very sensual experience when you kind of compare the two things.
And not being instant. The word instant, I think, it's time for reflection. It's time to unwind. It's slow. You have to wait for it to be right. Sit and ponder and think about the work you are doing. It's reflection. So it gives you time to reflect.
These are experiments. They are methods through which we can enlarge our understanding of the working practices of people in the past.
Finding metaphors, analogies, finding images that explain a process makes things a lot easier for us.
It really forces you to think about everything else that you might not have considered. What would that person have worn? What would they have looked like? And how does that relate to the object?
I am far more interested in thinking about the relationship between the maker and the body of the client and the intimacy between those two parts.
That for me was an important reason for why the project was interesting, because it was looking back and actually what these helmets meant.
It's one of the perfect subject areas to really kind of bring those different, often quite different practices together.
My lens from working in a factory and being aware now of all the importance of that stuff, but coming back full circle to working with these experts again, but trying to focus on, I guess, recording this in some way, because you can't record it. The tacit knowledge is something you can't record. It's only through that process of being in that space with that person. But it's finding the best way to somehow get there, through film, through kind of object, through text. So you're sort of piecing it together, but it's not the same. Yeah.
When we started out, I had a very strong inkling that lots of disciplines used recreative practice as a way of generating new knowledge, but diversity of ways in which disciplines use it, because people talk about reconstruction, people talk about reenactment, people talk about recreation, but in fact it all comes down to the physical object and needing to remake the physical object to have an experience of the past that mere description or photographs or fragments don't give you. In order to move to the future, we need to understand ourselves. We need to understand how we got to this point in history. And so working together, sharing knowledge, using each discipline's specific abilities to communicate more broadly is only to be celebrated, and it is going to be essential. It is essential.